Welcome back to the new adventures of the monad. Well, we have finally got here. We have arrived at the fifth root race, known as the Aryan root race. This is our current reality, although, as has been mentioned many times, the majority of human monads alive today are, in fact, from the fourth root race. Nevertheless, the root race is not only the new kid on the block, but the dominant one as well, politically, culturally, and economically. It was mentioned in the previous presentations that the Manu of the fifth root race, the Lord Vaivasvata, selected a group of monads, including the 1,200-year group, remember them? Whom he hoped to shape for his new root race, and with whom, therefore, he kept up a connection. This was about 1 million years ago. 400,000 years later, he made a further selection of likely candidates. Now, that is what I call forward planning. 1 million years ago, we were at the peak of the Toltec, the third subrace of the Atlantean root race, and yet seeds were being planted for what was to come next. The hierarchy thinks long-term. The first decisive step, however, in founding the race was about 100,000 years ago, when a tribe of the Atlantean fifth subrace, the Semites, who happened to have a pale complexion, was isolated in the mountains to the north of Ruta. This subrace was addicted to the mountains, the Cabals or Berbers of the Atlas Mountains being its best modern representatives. Their religion was different from that of the Toltecs living on the plains, a fact which the Manu took advantage of to effect the isolation. Then the Bodhisattva, the future Lord Buddha, founded a new religion. Those that came into it were told to keep apart and forbidden to intermarry with other tribes. This segregation made sense when you are trying to breed out a new race. But when carried on in later cultures, it would have tragic consequences. It is also worth noting the direct involvement of the Lord Buddha. He has been working his magic and guiding us for a long time. The people were told that they were under the king and lord physically unknown to them, and that they would be taken away to a promised land. Some, but not all, of the Hebraic story was probably derived from these facts. Owing to the impending subjugation of the fifth subrace by the dark ruler, a black magician of great power, the Manu in 79,797 BCE shipped his people off through the Sahara Sea and then by land to Arabia. A fleet of 30 ships was provided for the purpose. These were not more than 500 tons each. They were clumsy, running before the wind fairly well, but bad at tacking. Oars were also used. 3 trips were made, and about 9,000 people were brought over, together with some animals, which were a sort of a mixture of buffalo, elephant, and pig, something like a tapir. Out of the 9,000 people, 5/6 were from the fifth subrace, the Semites. 1/12 were Arcadian, and 1/12 were Toltec, each group being the best of its kind. At this time, there was a splendid Toltec civilization in Egypt, and as the emigrants passed through the country, the Egyptians tried to bribe them to remain. A few succumbed to the temptation, defying the Manu's commands, and later became slaves to the Toltecs. The rest, led by the Manu, reached the Arabian highlands, by way of what is now the route of the Suez Canal. The valleys were fertile when irrigated, the country being sparsely populated by a dark-skinned race. In one of the valleys, a large number of servers of the 1200 and 700-year groups settled. They were so fanatically devoted to the Manu that they drew upon themselves the anger of the Egyptians, who fought and attempted to exterminate them, though Vaivasvata Manu eventually drove out the Egyptians. After this, the colonists lived in peace for some time, cultivating their land and using various kinds of seeds they had brought from Atlantis. In about 2,000 years, they numbered several million. They were isolated from the world by a belt of sand, and the only way across it, with grass and water, being about where Mecca stands today. The least desirable types were sent away as emigrants, one party going to the south of Palestine and another to the south of Egypt. In one of the colonies, the horse was developed. Occasionally, in order to improve the human type, the Manu himself incarnated. The people were pastoral and agricultural and became so numerous as to cause overcrowding and risk depletion of resources. Accordingly, a very large number were sent to Africa to found a colony. This colony was later exterminated. A few years before the catastrophe of 75,025 BCE, under instructions from the head of the hierarchy, the Manu selected approximately 700 of his own descendants and made them into an unorthodox and strict sect. He formed them into a caravan and set off northwards. He sought and obtained peaceful passage through the dominion of the ruler of the Sumero-Akkadian Empire, encompassing what is now Turkey in Asia, Persia, and the countries beyond. In Turkestan, he negotiated with the Confederation of Turanian feudatory states, including what is now Tibet, and was permitted to pass. After some years, the caravan reached the Gobi Sea. Here it turned into the hills to the north, where a great shallow sea stretched northward to the poles. At this time, the Lemurian homeland was fragmented, its nearest point being about 1,000 miles to the north. The Manu posted some of his followers on a promontory looking to the northeast, but the majority he settled in a fertile, crater-like depression. A portion of land called the White Island was to the southeast and out of sight until later, when covered with lofty temples, it became visible. The White Island and its significance will be discussed in more detail later. Think of it as a diminished city of the Golden Gates. The people remained here until after the Great Catastrophe, which was then close at hand. The geological formation around the lake was such that unless the whole land was broken up, very little harm would be done by earthquakes. When the seismic changes were in progress, the community was undisturbed by absolute cleavage or change of the surface of the land, although the people were terrified by the recurring earthquakes. They were almost paralyzed by fear that the sun, invisible for a year owing to the clouds of fine dust, had gone out forever. Terrible rains fell incessantly, while masses of steam and clouds of dust darkened the air. Nothing would grow properly, and the people were exposed to severe deprivation. Of the original 700, which had increased to 1,000, only 300 of the strongest survived. At the end of 5 years, they again became settled, the weather became warm, and virgin soil was thrown up, which they were able to cultivate. The Manu by this time was an old man. He was ordered to bring his people to the White Island. There he was shown the plan of the future, stretching over tens of thousands of years. His people were to live on the shores of the Gobi Sea to increase and grow strong. The new race was to be founded on the White Island itself, and a great city was to be built on the opposite shore, the plan of this being suggested. There was a mountain range running along the shores of the Gobi Sea, some 20 miles distance, and the low hills stretched out from that range to the shore. 4 valleys, entirely separate from one another, ran down to the sea. The Manu was instructed to plant certain selected families in these valleys and develop from them 4 separate subraces, which were then to be sent out to different parts of the world. Some of his people were to be born in the outer world and were then to return and marry into his family in order to improve the racial type. He was then to incarnate and fix the improved type. 5 types were thus formed. the original main type on the island and 4 subtypes. You will come to see that the first 4 subraces of the 5th root race were incubated around the shores of this inland sea. About 70,000 BCE, the Manu instructed his people to settle and build villages on the mainland. Here they were to live and multiply for thousands of years. The Manu, the recognized king, resided at Shambhala. The Shambhala here is not the etheric construction I have spoken of in the past, but the white city on the island, which somehow seemed to be isolated from the turmoil that seemed to engulf the communities on the mainland. Some years later, the Manu instructed the monads, who were later to be Julius Caesar and H.P. Blavatsky, among others, to select certain of the best children and hothouse them in Shambhala. Some of them are the recognized masters we know of today. Soon after this, the Turanians swept down on the community, horde after horde, and eventually annihilated it. I told you the Turanians were a pain in the ass. The descendants of the children who had been saved eventually founded another populous and flourishing civilization that reached a higher level of civilization than before. Many of the servers we know today were included. They were often stupid and made many mistakes, but they were bound closely to those whom they served by loyalty and wholeheartedness. They built houses of great size and strongly fortified them along with their towns and villages against the savage Turanians who continuously harassed them. Again, they became a small nation, only to be once more massacred by the Turanians. A few children and their nurses being saved and brought up in Shambhala. The race type was in this way preserved, the Manu and his lieutenants incarnating in it as soon as possible to bring it nearer to the standard required. As mentioned earlier, it is noteworthy that even the bloodthirsty Turanians held the White Island in deep veneration and refrained from attacking it. Going back for a moment to the people who were left behind in Arabia when the Manu took his selected 700 to Central Asia, we may note that from those left behind were descended the Jews. We shall take up the history of the Jews again in a later presentation. See you next time. Thank you.